예, 안녕하십니까. 예, 오늘 행사는 기준 없이 한국판 출판을 기념하는 스티븐 샤비로 선생님의 어, 강연을 이 인터넷상으로 전 지구 인터넷 화상 강의라고 돼 있는데, 예, 강연을 하도록 예정돼서 이렇게 모였습니다. 예, 먼저 그 오늘 사회를 맡은 저는 그 선생님의 이 기준 없이 책을 번역한 역자입니다. 예, 이문교라고 합니다. 예. 예, 먼저 그 진행에 관해서 공지사항을 좀 말씀드리겠습니다. 예, 오늘 선생님의 강연은 10시부터 10시 50분까지로 일단 어, 계획이 되어 있고요. 강연이 끝난 다음에 한 10분 정도 휴식 시간을 갖고 11시부터 12시까지는 그 질의와 응답 그리고 이제 토론 시간을 갖도록 하겠습니다. 그리고 강연문 원문과 번역문은 이미 시작 전에 참가자 모든 분들께 메일로 보내드린 걸로 알고 있습니다. 또 강연 중에는 한글 번역문을 화면에 공유할 예정이니까 함께 봐주시면 되겠습니다. 그리고 오늘 통역을 맡아주실 분은 서강대학교 철학연구소의 강지아 선생님이신데요. 예, 저 진심으로 감사드립니다. 그리고 원활한 소통의 진행을 위해서 우리 스티븐 샤비로 선생님을 제외하고는 입장하신 모든 분들께서 그 이제 음소거 상태로 돼 있거든요. 그러니까 양해를 좀 부탁드리겠습니다. 물론 나중에 토의를 할 때는 그 제가 지정을 해드리면은 켜주시거나 아니면 이제 우리 김 선생님께서 다 해주실 테니까요. 하시면 되겠습니다. 예. 먼저 우리 강연자이신 스티븐 샤비로 교수님 소개를 해드린 시간인데 이렇게 길게 할 필요는 없을 것 같습니다. 그래도 또 모르시는 분들이 계실 것 같으니까 아주 짧게 말씀을 드리면 미국의 철학자십니다. 그리고 문화 비평가시고요. 예, 지금 현재 웨인 주립대학교 영어학과의 드로이 교수로 재직 중이시고요. 주된 관심사는 영화 이론, 예, 영화 이론으로 굉장히 유명하시죠. 시간, 미학, 또 과학 소설, 범심론, 예, 자본주의, 정동, 주체성, 예, 주체성 이런 개념을 가지고 주로 작업하시는 걸로 알고 있고요. 가장 그 널리 많이 읽힌 책이 1990년대 초 그 포스트 모더니즘의 상태를 개괄한 이론 픽션 작품 둠 페트롤스라는 책입니다. 그리고 영화 이론서인 더 시네마틱 바디라는 책이 있고요. 그다음에 이제 저는 철학을 전공하는데 예, 철학 전공자들에게 그래도 잘 알려진 책인 바로 이 책 기준 없이 예, 2009년에 나왔고 이제 올해 예, 발무리 출판사에서 번역됐습니다. 어, 이제 이 책 사실 이제 직접 쓰신 거는 이 책 이후에 쓰신 책인데 사물들의 우주 화이트헤드의 사변적 실제론에 관해 쓰신 책이 있고요. 국내 또 안호성 선생님에 의해서 번역이 됐죠. 그리고 2010년 작품인 탈인지 예, 이 책으로는 어, 2017년에 과학소설과 기술문화 연구상을 받으셨습니다. 예, 이 책 역시 안호성 선생님께서 아주 훌륭하게 번역해 주셨고요. 이 밖에도 이제 여러 어, 뮤직비디오, 예술 형식으로서의 뮤직비디오에 관한 방대한 작업도 하신 걸로 알려져 있고, 예, 그 밖에 이제 여러 예, 책들을 쓰시고 앞으로도 계획을 갖고 계신 걸로 알고 있습니다. 예, 그 다음에 이제 책 소개인데요. 이것도 그렇게 길게 말씀드릴 건 아닌데 아주 간단하게 말씀드리면 예, 어차피 강연하시는 중에 내용이 나올 거기 때문에 제가 또 길게 할 필요는 없을 것 같습니다. 그냥 간단하게 이 탈근대 이론, 특히 하이데거가 아닌 화이트헤드가 탈근대 이론을 탈근대적 사유를 위한 어떤 그 가이드 라인 내지는 선도적인 사상가였다면 어떻게 됐을까 이런 식으로 이제 가설적으로 문제를 제기하시면서 그 화이트헤드의 목소리에 특히 귀 기울이는 관점에서 미학 이론을 다시 사유하는 그런 책이라고 아주 간단하게 요약할 수 있을 것 같습니다. 특히 이제 저 같은 철학도들의 입장에서는 20세기 철학자인 프랑스의 철학자 질 둘레즈와의 그 교차적인 독해가 굉장히 인상적이고 감탄을 자아내는 그런 내용들이었는데요. 특히 이제 들레즈와 화이트헤드 사이에 그 중요한 공명과 친화성을 밝혀내시고 아주 독창적으로 해석해 내고 계십니다. 근데 이제 여기서 머무는 게 아니라 사실 우리 책 제목에도 나오지만은 이 화이트헤드와 들레즈의 여러 철학적 개념들, 관념들을 통해서 작업을 하시면서 칸트로 돌아갑니다. 예, 그래서 이 결국 칸트의 사유에 들어있는 아주 일정한 측면들이 화이트헤드와 들레즈의 그 철학적 구축론으로 가는 길을 열어주었다. 이 점을 굉장히 강조하고 계시고 굉장히 뭐 저도 개인적으로 많이 공감이 가는 주장이라서 사실 책을 번역하게 된 중요한 계기 중에 하나입니다. 예, 뭐 더 이상의 자세한 거는 우리 상세한 책 소개 보기가 있으니까 갈무리 출판사에서 예, 소개한 그 글을 참고해 주시기 바라고요. 자, 그러면 시간을 또 절약하기 위해서 우리 일부 강연을 시작하겠습니다. 예, 우리 스티븐 샤비로 선생님을 박수로 모셔보겠습니다. 예.
Should I begin?
Yes, let's welcome so Shabiro with applause.
Thank
Yeah, you can
Okay.
begin.
I would like to thank Galmuri Press for publishing a Korean translation of my book, Without Criteria, Kant, Whitehead, Deleuze, and Aesthetics. This is the third book of mine that Galmuri Press has had translated. Without Criteria was first published in English in 2009. It has been a good while since I've looked at it, but in a very real sense, this book provided the grounds for everything that I've written since. Without Criteria has two major aims. On the one hand, it is an effort to understand the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead and to put this philosophy in contact with the post-structuralist thought of French philosophy in the 1960s and 1970s, as typified for me by the writings of Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, and especially Gilles Deleuze. On the other hand, at the same time, the book endeavors to make a case for aesthetics rather than ethics or metaphysics as first philosophy. Alfred North Whitehead was a British mathematician and philosopher. He was born in 1861 and died in 1947. He passed through several distinct stages in the course of his intellectual career. Whitehead started out as a mathematician and taught at Cambridge University in the UK, starting in 1884. He became especially interested in the foundations of mathematics, the question of how we could be sure that mathematics was correct. This phase of his research culminated in his collaboration with Bertrand Russell on Principia Mathematica from 1901 to 1911, a massive effort to ground mathematics in symbolic logic. This project did not succeed. It was later proven by Kurt Gödel and others that it could not succeed. Gödel showed in the early 1930s that any logical system generates propositions that can neither be proved nor disproved within the system. You will never find a counterexample to such a proposition, but you cannot establish its truth rigorously either. This means that mathematics cannot be systematically grounded. No mathematical system can be both complete and consistent. Whitehead perhaps had a certain intuition of this. Several decades before Gödel published his proof, Whitehead gave up on his quest for logical certainty. In 1910, along with his abandonment of symbolic logic, Whitehead left Cambridge and moved to London. For the next 14 years, he worked as both a teacher and an administrator in various units of the University of London system. During these years, Whitehead was deeply involved in reform of the British higher education system. At the time, reform meant two things. The first was opening previously all-male programs to women. The second was adding modern topics to the humanities curriculum instead of just focusing on the classics, ancient Greek and ancient Latin. During this period, Whitehead became interested in the philosophical foundations of physics. When Whitehead first entered the university system in the 1880s, physicists believed that they understood the basic outlines of how the universe worked. But anomalous results connected with astronomical observations and with the discovery of radioactivity destroyed this consensus by the end of the 19th century. The science was thrown into crisis. The first few decades of the 20th century witnessed a revolution in physics with the development of quantum mechanics and of Einstein's special and general theories of relativity. Whitehead closely observed these developments. He became deeply concerned with the question of how these indubitable but counterintuitive discoveries could be related to our everyday commonsensical experience of the world. The astronomer Arthur Eddington, a one-time student of Whitehead, noted the disjunction between the way that a physical object appears to immediate sensory experience and to common sense more generally, and the way that the same object is understood by modern physics. Whitehead sought to bridge this disparity, since after all, it is only through empirical experience in the first place that we can get the data upon which the scientific understanding of the physical world is based. In trying to answer this question, Whitehead has published his first important philosophical books, An Enquiry Concerning the Principles of Natural Knowledge in 1919, The Concept of Nature in 1920, The Principle of Relativity in 1922, and Science in the Modern World in 1924. Gradually, in the course of these writings, Whitehead's attention shifted from the philosophy of science in particular to more general philosophical questions. The split between common sense and scientific understandings of objects, he came to believe, was only one example of a much deeper problem. Whitehead diagnosed what he called the bifurcation of nature in modern Western culture. This is the division between phenomenal experience and the physical explanation of such experience. On the one hand, we have, for instance, a quote, the greenness of the trees, the song of the birds, the warmth of the sun, the hardness of the chairs, and the feel of the velvet. On the other hand, we have the conjectured system of molecules and electrons, which so affects the mind as to produce the awareness of apparent nature. These two sets of relations seem to have nothing in common. Whitehead deplores such a bifurcation at the heart of nature and seeks for ways to heal this split. The bifurcation of nature is arguably still a crucial problem for us today, despite all the changes and technological advances that have taken place in the century since Whitehead's time. Scientific and humanistic accounts of the world remain at odds with one another today. One of the ways that we experience this bifurcation, in the United States at least, is in the form of the division in our universities between STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and everything else, including especially what used to be called the humanities. The STEM subjects continue to be emphasized, while the humanities are progressively defunded. Within Anglo-American philosophy in particular, the bifurcation of nature takes the form of the distinction between the analytic and continental schools of philosophy. Continental thought, including phenomenology, starts out from the immediate sensations of subjective experience. Analytic philosophy, on the other hand, starts out from questions of logic, as well as from the molecules and electrons that are the causal basis of any subjective experience. In order to overcome the bifurcation of nature, Whitehead delved ever more deeply into metaphysical questions, or what he called cosmological questions. This broadening of focus was enabled when, in 1924, at the age of 63, Whitehead was invited to join the philosophy department of Harvard University in the United States. Whitehead was pleased to be offered a position in the very program where his favorite philosopher, William James, had once taught. And so he left Great Britain and moved to the United States, where he remained for the rest of his life. In 1929, while he was teaching at Harvard, Whitehead published his magnum opus, the vast and dazzling book, Process and Reality. In the following decade, he published two more important books, Adventures of Ideas in 1933 and Modes of Thought in 1938. In these texts, Whitehead develops his own philosophical system which refers back to the major trends of Western philosophy, from Descartes through Kant, but which also departs from these trends in important ways. Whitehead even suggests that his philosophy, a quote, seems to approximate more to some strains of Indian or Chinese thought than to Western, Asiatic, or European thought. I know too little of Asian philosophy to be able to judge the truth of this suggestion, but I mention it for your interest. Whitehead finally retired from teaching in 1937 at the age of 76. He remained in America until he died a decade later. His influence faded considerably, however, in the years following his death. For much of the later 20th century, Whitehead was largely ignored in Western philosophical circles. His legacy was kept alive only by a small group of Protestant Catholic theologians, most notably Dr. John B. Cobb, who recently celebrated his 99th birthday and is still very intellectually active. Part of the reason for the decline of Whitehead's influence in the later 20th century is because his philosophy remained something of an anomaly in the general climate of Anglo-American academia. Whitehead's thought does not fit well into either the analytic or the continental tradition. His early work on logic and mathematics had a strong influence on analytic philosophy, primarily through Bertrand Russell. In addition, W.V.O. Quine, one of the most important analytic philosophers of the latter part of the 20th century, wrote his PhD dissertation, which focused on the Principia Mathematica under Whitehead's supervision. But Whitehead's later thought moves far away from logical and mathematical basics. The major themes of Whitehead's later philosophy, fundamental questions about time and space and the nature of human and non-human existence, have more in common with the concerns of continental philosophy. But Whitehead is quite far from any of the major figures of the continental tradition, Hegel, Nietzsche, Husserl, and Heidegger. Indeed, he seems not to have even read any of these, and his thought differs from theirs in both vocabulary and focus. Rather than favoring either side of the analytic-continental divide, Whitehead seeks to develop an inclusive position that finds room for both approaches and places them both on an equal footing. In addition, Whitehead is fairly unique in the 20th century in his attitude toward the very process of doing philosophy. Most 20th century Western thinkers, like Wittgenstein and Carnap on the analytic side, as well as Heidegger and Derrida on the continental side, are concerned above all with eliminating metaphysics or extricating thought from metaphysics. For both sides, metaphysics is identified with delusion and mystification. Whitehead, to the contrary, never denounces or seeks to escape from metaphysics. Instead, he continues to describe what he does as metaphysics, or more often, a word he prefers, as cosmology. In presenting his thought in this way, Whitehead runs the risk, already in his own time, and all the more so today, a century later, of making his philosophy sound old-fashioned and out of date. However, I am more inclined to see Whitehead's continuing commitment to metaphysics and cosmology as an implicit rebuke to the unacknowledged and indeed unconscious parochialism of Western modernity, which fancied itself completely new and completely disentangled from the past. Western modernism in the early 20th century certainly saw itself as a moment of extreme rupture. As Virginia Woolf famously wrote, not entirely ironically, in an essay from 1924, quote from Woolf, "On or about December 1910, human character changed. All human relations have shifted, those between masters and servants, husbands and wives, parents and children. And when human relations change, there was at the same time a change in religion, conduct, politics, and literature," end of quote. But Whitehead himself seems to have experienced this rupture more in terms of the revolutions in physics than in terms of the changes in human relations and through them in literature, art, and culture more generally. Whitehead was friends with the great American modernist experimental writer Gertrude Stein, but otherwise he does not seem to have many connections with modernist art and culture. Whitehead's aesthetics places great stress on novelty, but he develops this aesthetics in a way that is not specifically bound to the cultural ferment of his own time. Nevertheless, there has been something of a revival in Whitehead studies starting at the end of the last century and continuing to the present one. Gilles Deleuze briefly discussed Whitehead in his book on Leibniz, published in French in 1988 and translated to English in 1993. Slightly later, important books in Whitehead were published by Judith Jones, Intensity, an essay in Whiteheadian ontology from 1998, and by the Belgian philosopher Isabel Stengers, Thinking with Whitehead, a free and wild creation of concepts, which first appeared in French in 2002 and was translated to English in 2011. It is largely due to Isabel Stengers' writings that I myself first started reading Whitehead. My interest in his thought may be unusual since I am not a philosopher, but rather a scholar of cinema on the one hand and of science fiction literature on the other hand. I was also trained as a graduate student in the thought of such post-structuralist thinkers as Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, and Gilles Deleuze. And so it is in the context of these thinkers, together with Stengers, that I first came to read and try to understand Whitehead. In Without Criteria, I pay special attention to the surprising and unexpected affinities between Whitehead's thought and that of Gilles Deleuze. These two thinkers may seem very different at first glance, but they both see the world as composed of open multiplicities. Both of them tell us that these multiplicities are finite but ongoing processes, rather than fixed underlying substances. Instead of presupposing any sort of pre-given stability, both thinkers try to work out the ways in which relative fixities, more or less stable selves of things, are able to emerge out of chaos and maintain themselves, at least for a certain amount of time. Whitehead accomplishes this in part by rejecting what he calls the subject-predicate forms of thought that have dominated Western philosophy since Aristotle. That is to say, according to Whitehead, the world is not composed of separate substances to which various qualities can be attributed. Rather, the world is made of processes rather than of things. It is better described by verbs and adverbs than by nouns and adjectives. Rather than saying that the wall in front of me is painted red, I should more accurately speak of the ongoing reddening that reaches my eyeballs and affects my senses, and the ongoing process of resisting collapse and holding the building together that we might well call the action of walling. The point, however, is not to reform our modes of speech, but rather to grasp how even the most stable and seemingly unchanging things are still involved in continual processes of becoming. Think of how an eddy forms in a stream and maintains its whirlpool motion, even as the water streaming through it continually flows away and is replaced. And then think of the way that we, as biological organisms, maintain and renew our bodies and minds for the entire stretch of our lives. My seeming identity from one moment to the next is the result of an unending progression of intertwined metabolic processes, which will continue until I die. The stream is a fairly simple physical structure, while living organisms like ourselves are extremely complex ones. But streams and biological organisms alike are instances of what Ilya Prigogine calls dissipative systems, structures that maintain themselves far from thermodynamic equilibrium. In all such systems, organization and relative stability arise out of processes of continual change. This is even the case for seemingly fixed physical objects. Whitehead gives us the example of Cleopatra's Needle, an Egyptian stone obelisk that now stands on the Victoria Embankment in central London on the bank of the River Thames. It is one of a pair. Its twin stands in Central Park in New York City. The pillar was originally erected in Heliopolis in ancient Egypt in the 15th century BC. It was moved from Heliopolis to Alexandria in the 1st century BC. And it was plundered and taken from Alexandria to London in 1877 AD, where it remains to this day. Whitehead reminds us that even this seemingly solid stone pillar is not really unchanging. That is partly because of human histories of imperialism and colonialism, which led to the columns being moved several times over the course of millennia. In addition, Whitehead points out the physicist knows that the pillar is caught up in a continual dance of electrons, so that, quote, daily it has lost some molecules and gained others, and even the plain man can see that it gets dirtier and is occasionally washed, end of quote. At some date in the far future, if not sooner, the pillar is bound to be toppled or eroded away. Just give it enough time. Everything everywhere is continually in process, even if in some cases the ongoing events are too slow or too widely distributed over space and time for us to perceive them all at once. How a relative stability emerges from continual change is a major concern for both Whitehead and Deleuze. Both thinkers anticipate late 20th and early 21st century interest in questions of emergence and of the production of novelty. Most important of all, from my own particular perspective, is the way that Whitehead and Deleuze alike place aesthetics at the center of their philosophies. This is what links them to Immanuel Kant, whose third volume of Critique, The Critique of Judgment, is a foundational discussion of aesthetics in modern Western thought. Kant subordinates aesthetics both to epistemology, the subject of the first critique, the critique of pure reason, and to morality, the subject of the second critique, the critique of practical reason. But in doing so, he opens up the aesthetic as a realm of exceptions or of particular instances that cannot be run together and generalized. Each aesthetic instance is unique. In its sheer singularity, aesthetic enjoyment escapes the strictures, both of empirical understanding and of moral law. In Kant's account, an aesthetic feeling is different from an empirical fact, and it is also different from a judgment of right and wrong. For Kant, both facts and moral judgments are objectively universal. They must be the same for everyone without exception. Aesthetic judgments, however, are different. They are always singular. I would very much like for everyone to share my sense of the greatness of, say, the novels of Ursula Le Guin, the films of R.W. Fassbinder, the symphonic music of Anna Torvaldsdottir, and the music videos of Tierra Whack. But I cannot justify my feelings about these works, much less convince other people about them by appealing either to empirical facts or to moral necessities. This is why my book argues that aesthetic judgments, in contrast to empirical or moral ones, exist without criteria. I deeply care about the works I love, and I ask others to share my feelings. In this way, aesthetic judgments strive towards universality. But at best, this is merely a subjective universality, Kant says, which should not be confused with objective universality. I can explain in great detail why and how I love these particular works and the ways in which I find them valuable and moving. I can point out features of these works that other readers, viewers, or listeners might not have noticed. Indeed, doing all this is precisely my job as a teacher and as a cultural critic. But Kant warns me that I cannot logically prove to anyone who does not already share my taste that they should feel about these works of art in the same way that I do. That's why Kant says that we can argue about aesthetic judgments, but we cannot dispute about them. That is to say, however eloquently and vehemently I express my aesthetic tastes, I cannot demonstrate these tastes logically, and I cannot appeal to objective grounds to justify them. To my mind, Kant's discussion of aesthetics is one of the most important aspects of his philosophy, even though it is usually given less prominence than his arguments about knowledge in the first critique and about morality in the second critique. Part of Kant's point is that because great works of art are unique or singular, they cannot give rise to categories of the understanding, which regulates empirical knowledge, and they cannot be the foundation of commands or imperatives, which ground morality in Kant's system. This also means, according to Kant, that great works of art cannot really be imitated. Any attempt to do so results in works that are unconvincing failures. Rather, Kant says, great works of art are exemplary. This means that they can be emulated, but not successfully imitated. Original works can inspire new works that do not imitate them, which would not be original, but that instead strive to follow their example by trying to be original in their own turn. The argument of without criteria is that both Whitehead and Deleuze take Kantian aesthetic practice, grounded in examples and emulation, and apply that practice to the very realms of metaphysical speculation from which Kant excluded them. Aesthetics is no longer an exception to the rules of epistemology and ethics, but instead becomes the very ground for their practices. That is to say, my claim in this book is that both Whitehead and Deleuze take up Kant's aesthetic exceptionalism in a radical way. They push Kant's account of aesthetic judgment to an extreme point that would probably have horrified Kant himself, but that is nonetheless still derived from Kant's own formulations. Whitehead's cosmology begins with what he calls actual occasions, and Deleuze's account of being begins with what he calls singularities. Both of these would be regarded by Kant as aesthetic exceptions to the grounding concept of the understanding and the imperatives of moral law. But Whitehead and Deleuze alike argue that such aesthetic instances come first. It is not that they diverge from pre-existing norms, but the reverse. It is only on the basis of such unruly instances and by aggregating them that the norms to which they fail to conform can be retroactively posited. Whitehead explains his project most explicitly when he describes his ambition, and this is a quote, to construct a critique of pure feeling in the philosophical position which Kant put his critique of pure reason, unquote. In this way, feeling not only precedes rational thought, but also provides the necessary basis for any articulation of rationality. Whitehead adds that this should also supersede the remaining critiques required in the Kantian philosophy. This does not mean that blind feeling should replace rational cognition, but rather that feeling is the necessary basis upon which cognition can be developed. This is confirmed by recent research on the brain. For instance, the neuroscientist Antonio Damasio has shown that people whose emotions have been stunted are unable to make rational decisions. For Whitehead, therefore, truths and obligations must themselves be articulated upon the basis of feelings, which means within an aesthetic framework. As for Deleuze, at one early point in his career, he describes his short book on Kant as a book on an enemy. But later on, Deleuze credits Kant, and particularly the Kant of the Critique of Judgment, with 4 poetic formulas that liberate time from its subordination to movement and to measure. This again takes us well beyond the limitations established in the first 2 critiques. While Kant attempted to legislate the limits of thought in the first 2 critiques, in his final aesthetic critique, he gives us instead what Deleuze describes as, quote, a tempest in the depths of a chasm opened up with a subject, or an atonal music of pure feeling. These are the issues that I attempted to explore in my book with that criteria. The aim of the book is not to come to definitive conclusions, but to open up new paths for intellectual and affective exploration. And these are the paths that led me to the work of my subsequent books that deal with such things as science fiction novels and music videos. Okay, thank you. That's what I wrote in advance.
예, 선생님 말씀을 잘 경청 하신 것 같습니다. 여러분들, 예, 언제나 제가 느낀 그 소감을 하나 말씀드리면 선생님의 글은 참 항상 클리어하고 굉장히 아름답다는 생각이 들었는데 오늘도 역시 그런 생각이 들었습니다. 오늘 강연해 주신 내용이 굉장히 농축적이라서 예, 조금 이제 여러분들 질문을 하시려면 생각도 필요하고 또 선생님께서도 좀 휴식을 가지셔야 되니까 저희가 예정된 시간보다는 조금 빨리 끝났지만은 그래도 한 10분 정도 휴식 시간을 갖는 게 좋을 것 같습니다. 예. 그러면 지금 시간이 32분이니까 정확하게 42분에 다시 돌아와서 예, 질의응답과 토론 시간을 갖도록 하겠습니다. 예, 감사합니다.